So now you've made this decision. Let's look at the specifics of how you're going to put it together before you start officially homeschooling. There really are essentially 3 steps that I think, well, first, before we even get to those 3 steps, a lot of people say, like, well, how do I get started homeschooling? What do I do? The most important thing to remember is you're already homeschooling. If you have been raising your children from birth until they're compulsory school age, you are technically homeschooling them. You've helped them learn to talk, walk, socialize, perhaps even count and read. And why stop what's working? It's part of this continuum. You don't really need to become a professional teacher. You might need to learn some new things, and we're going to talk about that, of course, and how to be a good facilitator and help find good teachers and places for your child to flourish. But you don't have to be somebody else other than yourself in order to be a homeschooler. So really, I can't emphasize that enough, that you're already doing it, and now you're just going to embrace it more, because now you're officially a homeschooler. So there really are just 3 steps that you need to know to homeschool legally and successfully in America. First, you want to know your state's regulations, or their homeschooling law if they have one. Second, you want to develop your curriculum so that you can explain to parents, other parents, and as well as school officials, what you're doing with your children this year, or have done with them, as we're going to talk about after the fact curriculum too. And the last thing is enjoy your family. Everything falls into place when you create schedules and plans that you can control. When mom and dad are at ease, the kids will be at ease too. And trust will flow from this. Trust will develop from your time together. Trust that your children will learn, even if it's on a different schedule than they would learn in school. And trust that you, as their parent, will help them when they need your help. A lot of parents lose their faith in their abilities and think that they can't do it because teaching is so complicated. Yes, teaching 30 children or 20 children in a class, even 10 children in a class, is much more complicated than teaching your own children. You don't need the skills that are needed to teach in the schools are different and absolutely can get in the way of what is needed when you're teaching at home. And this is one of those great debates that happen with educators because they want to just impose the school method in the home, but there really is no need to do that. Although, if you want to and you're comfortable with that, you can, and I'm going to briefly describe that for you today. But before you settle on what curriculum you're going to use and so on, you want to find out, like, can I do it? And if I do it, what do I have to do throughout the year to stay legal? And of course, there have been underground homeschoolers forever. I mean, when I started in 1981 at Holt Associates, there were parents who didn't want their issues of Growing Without Schooling magazine to have any identifying features, so we called it the brown paper wrapper subscribers. We would just send them out that way because they didn't want even the postman to know that they were homeschooling for fear that someone would crack down on them. That's no longer the case because homeschooling is legal in every state in America. So you don't have to worry about that. But it's all right. What I want to do is make you struggle just a teeny little bit about how to find out your homeschooling laws, because it's important. I think it's important that you share this with your children too, that you can and should look up these laws that affect you and that you need and that you want to make sure that they're being enacted properly against you if they are used against you. And so if I told you the laws in all 50 states and then explain these 11 states, right now there's 11 states that have very minimal requirements. They essentially treat you as a private school and let you do what you want. And then there are other states that have a lot of regulations, quarterly reports, quarterly tests, and annual evaluations, and so on. And then there's a lot of states in the middle, and there are states like Massachusetts that don't have a law. We have regulations, and we deal with the local officials. So everything is different across America. It's gonna, it's hard to give a blanket statement. And so I don't want you to get dependent on me for your political news. So what you should do is, back in the day, you had to go to a courthouse or the state house and look up compulsory education or school attendance. But now you can do it on the internet, and that's what I urge you to do. So the first step, though, that could be the first, but even before that, the first step would be to speak with current homeschoolers first. The people who are currently interacting with the school system so that they can homeschool. I have the most accurate information for you. You might want to talk to a couple or different groups of people, because school at home people are going to be much more comfortable meeting all the testing requirements that a school might want to throw at you, versus an unschooler or an eclectic homeschooler who feels that, no, my 8-year-old's going to study Japanese and you don't even have a test for that. So how would you know that? So speak with current homeschoolers first and find out what they do to stay in compliance with whatever homeschooling laws and regulations they have to work with. Second, you should look them up, as I said, under compulsory education and school attendance. In fact, nowadays with the internet, some state departments of education have PDFs or just little FAQs about homeschooling in their state. All right. You don't have to be a certified teacher to homeschool in any state in America. So don't let that get thrown in your face that you're not certified so you can't teach. This is, many private schools don't use certified teachers. Certified it does not always mean qualified. It just means that they've passed the tests. As we know, I mean, there are many certified teachers who are quite good, and there are some who are quite bad. So certification is not a requirement for a homeschooler, although for a public schooler it is, a public school teacher. And then finally, you don't need the school's permission to remove your child from school if they're having difficulty. But you do have to be aware of truancy problems. So let me dig a little deeper on this one, because what I'm referring to is if you have a child in school, let's say they're in first, second, third grade, and they don't like school anymore. They're being picked on by bullies. The class is going too quickly for them, and they feel confused and at sea, or the class is going too slowly for them, and they're bored and they're getting into mischief, or they're just complaining and disconnected from school. Naturally, you want to talk to the school, because you could take your child out and put them in another school without any difficulty, but you do have to tell them that that's what you're going to do. But often if you walk up to a school and say, I'm going to homeschool my child, they might say why, and try to work things out with you, which is fine. Maybe that would work out great if that can happen. But more often than not, what might happen is they say, you can't homeschool now. You have to finish out the semester. You can't homeschool now until XX paperwork is... well, if your child is suffering, literally, bully situations are particularly bad now, but they've always been around. I mean, we're much more aware of them now because they've gotten so horrible as a result of internet harassment and other issues. But bullying was around even in the 60s when I was in grammar school. But if you need to get your child out of a bad situation and the school is saying, oh, you got to wait for such and such permission and blah, blah, take them out and say they're sick. If you have a sympathetic doctor or psychologist, particularly a psychologist or a doctor who understands that the child's bullying is not going to be addressed simply by having a teacher say, don't do that to so-and-so, because they can't see what's going on in the bathroom, in the playground, all these other things, on the school bus. So if your child's in a bad situation, you take them out for medical reasons. They could be out for up to 2 weeks before they're considered truant. And then you could just keep getting doctors' letters and other things to string this out until you finally do get your leave of absence, so to speak. But most likely, again, this is not that common anymore. This would happen. Most schools are aware that the parent has a right to take their child out. It's nice if you could do it with a plan and say we're going to leave at the end of the month or at the end of a particular project or after certain vacations so that it's minimal disruption. But more often than not, parents are homeschooling out of desperation because they can't afford private school. None of the other public schools are any better than the one their kids are in, and their kids are really suffering in school, and they got to get them out now. So if you're in that situation, you have the right to do that, and you can do that. So
I have a question, Pat.
yes, go right ahead.
So what does this look like for parents or kids who have decided they would like to homeschool, but they're not sure if they might want to go back to school at a later date?
That is still not a problem because, you know, unless you're going to go back to the same school with the same principal and he's got a chip on his shoulder, they still can't deny you access to a public school. Um, you know, but I recommend not burning bridges as much as possible, as no one knows the future. You know, you don't know, what sort of support you might need. But the matriculation of kids moving in and out of school, from school to homeschool, has not proven to be difficult. In my own case, all three of my daughters have moved in and out of school. My youngest in particular, she went in and out of third grade, I think twice, and the school was right around the corner from our house. So it is possible to move in and out, and as we used to say, we have a swinging door between our home and the school, and we told our kids, if you want to go, you can go, but if you want to leave, you can leave. And our school was comfortable with that, but I'm aware of other schools that are not, and I just want you to know that the law is on your side. That yeah, it may get issue. They may want to claim truancy, but if it becomes a legal case, your child is suffering, and you're trying to protect them from harm, and I don't think any school is going to take you to court for that.
Great, thank you.
So now that's the basic outlines. As I said, you need to dig deep into your state to find out if there are particular requirements to be met, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But now that you understand how to apply, or just send your letter of intent, just to announce that you're going to homeschool to the state and make sure that legally you're covered there. What do? Well, if you've looked at the world of education, despite phrases like Common Core and general education credits and stuff, there really aren't that much common, and there really isn't that much, in terms of philosophies and ways that things get done. Even conventional schools. I mean, my gosh, you can have, E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy, or any sort of charter school, Montessori. There's all sorts of school-at-home options. And then, and so I've tried to boil this down into three broad categories, and within each one of these categories, there's many subcategories. But just for brevity's sake, I thought it would be useful to look at it this way. So we have, school at home, buy a curriculum, follow it, buy the textbooks, run through the exercises, grade them, hand them in. You could also do this with correspondence schools. The Calvert School has been doing this for missionaries' children since the 50s or 60s, and now in the 80s they discovered homeschooling, and they've become one of the biggest secular suppliers of conventional curriculum to homeschoolers. There are many school-at-home options, and it's one of the easiest things to find out about. Eclectic homeschooling. It's funny. I used to feel I couldn't quite understand the difference between that and unschooling, because unschooling is also very eclectic. But then I realized what seems to really bother people about unschooling is giving children control over what they want to learn. And eclectic homeschooling is trying to pick and choose. They may say, I'm going to have my child take algebra at the local Kumon Academy and do conventional school at home for math, but I'll let them do nature study and have as much free time to work with animals as they want, and so and so's farm, whatever. So they're trying to mix and match, but basically they're still trying to do it from the point of view of how do I match up requirements to my school requirements to my child's abilities and so on. And unschooling and therefore they're not, while they may again, it's so hard because it's so similar in schooling to me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it probably is just this philosophical issue rather than the actual implementation of the process. So they want to make sure that they're in charge, the parents in charge, and that's fine. I mean, why not? I mean, that's your prerogative, and if you're sensitive to your child's needs, of course that can work. And then unschooling posits that children are good at learning, and that learning is the result of the activity of learners, not the activity of teachers. And I think that's the big distinction, because eclectic and school at home still think that if I teach, they will learn, whereas unschooling takes the position, as anyone who's ever taught in school or taught anywhere knows, I teach, but they don't always learn. So, we get kind of hung up in America because we keep focusing on teaching and instructing, thinking that we could force feed anything into anybody if we come up with the magic teaching formula. But it doesn't work that way, and that's what John Holt and many other educators have said for decades, if not generations. And so what they want to do is work with the child, and let a child unfold in their own time, and therefore they're going to have different learning schedules. Now, don't get hung up in this. And this is something that I find every one of these do. Everyone sort of gets into a bunker mentality. Like, I'm an unschooler and I don't want to talk to anyone who does anything other than let's say kids do whatever they want. And same thing with school at home. And then of course it breaks down even further when we get into religions and educational philosophies. The Montessorians don't want anything to do with unschoolers, and the unschoolers don't want anything to do with the conventional homeschooler. It gets crazy after a while, because in reality, unschoolers use classes on occasion. Unschooled children are curious to know what's going on in school. Kids who are being taught a very rigorous school-at-home method want to know what it's like to spend all day playing or do a whole project like those other kids, those unschoolers. So I mean, and eclectic homeschoolers, sometimes I'm sure that they wonder, boy, why don't I just let go of all this and see what happens for a week? And so and that's the beauty of homeschooling. None of this, once you commit to it, it doesn't mean that you commit it forever. Once you start seeing school at home stop working for you, and many parents, and I recommend, a lot of people are scared. Just the word unschooling scares them, because they think it means that you do nothing with your child. You do nothing with education. But parents who are at school at home start to realize, I'm spending all this time trying to teach my kid math, but they're just fascinated with nature and how things grow and botany, and so why don't I focus on that instead? Eventually, over time, a lot of people leave school at home, and become a blend. In fact, talking about unschooling, when John Holt created the words to mean, Webster's defines it as untaught, or as being a natural. So it's always been in the dictionary. But John actually wanted to make it sort of a term that was preferable to homeschooling, because he didn't want people to get the idea that all the learning had to happen at home and it had to look like school. So John wrote this in Growing Without Schooling #2. Here's John Holt's definition of unschooling and deschooling. And it's a political and educational definition, not the lifestyle definition that unschooling has become. It's very interesting. If you look in Teach Your Own, the only book that John wrote specifically about homeschooling, and that I updated in 2003, but if you look in the original index of that book, and you look up the word unschooling, it says see homeschooling. It was not this horrible big distinction that we now have, where everyone's in separate camps. This is really it. And then of course, we have all sorts of people who've taken these ideas of John's and used them. And this is what it is. It's beautiful. 1,000 flowers are blooming from this one seed that John Holt said about trusting children, and trust yourselves to help your children to learn. And there's another book. It's funny. These are books that I've been familiar with for years, but there are a couple of others that I'm familiar with. Julie Polanco has wrote a book called Finding Joy, A Christian's Journey to an Unschooled Life, and came out in 2011. Susie Andres has written a book, A Little Way of Homeschooling. It's 13 Catholic homeschoolers talking about their personal stories about becoming unschoolers. Because a lot of people think that, that education as we know it is deeply tied into everything else in our lives, like religion. But guess what? You can unschool all these things. You don't have to keep following the same old paths, the same old tired railroad tracks. This is the 21st century. Let's leave the railroad. So there's a lot of adaptability here. And then, in this study that Dr. Brian Ray did in a book called Strengths of Their Own, I was really fascinated because a lot of his research focuses on the conservative Christian homeschool market. And there, 71% of homeschoolers design, handpick their own curriculum. Only 23.8, 24% of homeschoolers that he studied buy a whole curriculum package. Again, it's easy to start with what you know, and we tend to teach the way we were taught, just as we tend to parent the way we were parented. But if we want to do something different than what our parents did, if we want to do something different than our teachers, we must make a conscious effort to do it. And I think that that's what those 71% parent-designed curriculum people are doing. They're taking control and saying, I'm going to figure out what my child wants to learn. And just because it's not on the Common Core schedule for this month doesn't mean we're not going to do it. I've been invited to speak, about John Holt's work in unschooling to groups of Mormons, Christian Scientists, atheists, Buddhists, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, spiritualists, and more. John's ideas are very important on many levels to many people, and I don't want to create a monoculture of unschoolers. Now, one of the things that we talk about when you're getting started is well, what about special needs children? That's where you really need a special parent, specially trained parent. You couldn't possibly homeschool them. Well, again, you can homeschool children with special needs, and it's been done for many, many years. You see, this is a cover of Growing Without Schooling from 1998. We're writing about it back then, and now there's more resources for it out there. I wanted to say at this time that the handout that goes with this webinar has a lot of resources, websites, and books for special needs, homeschooling special needs children, as well as all the topics I'm talking about, in this discussion. So if I seem to give short shrift to something, check the PDF handout, see if that you might find more information. And if you don't, feel free to contact me through Facebook, the website Starting to Homeschool, the Facebook page Starting to Homeschool. I'm happy to answer your questions. So special needs children, they do present a little bit of a difficulty in terms of getting homeschooling approval. Not approval, for you to do it to homeschool, it's your right. You don't have to get approved, but you do have to come up with a plan. So if your special needs child is already in school, they have service contracts, IEPs, and other things that are already in place. And they're quite expensive for the school district and the school personnel, and so there may be pressure to keep your child in the program for a variety of reasons that have little to do with your child's personal growth and needs, as you see it. So it can be difficult if they're already in school. And in fact, I know, and I hope that this isn't true now in the 21st century, but back in the early 1990s, I had a mom who wanted to homeschool her special needs child, and she was a special ed instructor. She had a Massachusetts certificate, and she had to threaten to go to court. And fortunately, they were able to settle out of court because the program didn't think that even though she had a certificate, that she would be qualified for taking care of her own special needs child. But as I've learned from this issue of the magazine, by the way, is online on the whole, all the issues of Growing Without Schooling. So if you want to read this story, but this gentleman tells a story about the reason he and his son decided that it would be better for them to homeschool is because he would spend so much time getting his son ready to get onto the special bus, all the special equipment, and in the wheelchair, all this effort. 2 hours sometimes to just get him ready to go to school, and then 2 hours to decompress from school. You know, that it just was easier and much more relaxing for both of them to homeschool. Cindy Gaddis has written a lot about this. She has a wonderful book called The Right Side of Normal. She's a homeschooling mom who learned about special needs by doing, and so it's a great model. There's a Facebook page called Unschooling Special Needs. I highly recommend you checking that out if you want support. And then Thomas Armstrong's books, which I have on the handout, are other good resources. One thing that I have to say about special needs education that I think is just wonderful is how open it is and has been to unschooling, but they'll never use the word unschooling. They call them embedded learning opportunities, you know, and they have to be identified by, you know, educators or whatever. But, you know, look, shopping and making change for the purchases, that's an, you know, but they call that community-based instruction. So, and it's state-of-the-art instruction, by the way, people. So, you know what? You can use these same phrases in your reports to school officials at the end of the year. We use state-of-the-art, community-based instruction, shopping, making change, and this doesn't have to be for special needs children either. This could be for young, you know, for first, second graders, anyone who's learning how to calculate, make change, and socialize. So take advantage of these embedded learning opportunities. But better yet, recognize that the world is embedded with learning opportunities. They're not put there by educators to get you to learn. This is the way the world is. The world is full of embedded learning opportunities, and that's what unschooling is about, letting your child discover that and supporting them through it, you know? This isn't rocket science. This is why I say you don't need to be a professional teacher, because they have different skills and need them because of the situation that they're instructing in. You're instructing in the flow of your daily life, which you know quite well, and that you can alter as you need. So, for developing your education plan, you know, first of all, I want to emphasize, not every state requires an education plan. So I know I'm being a little cagey here, but you know, there are 11 states where you just say we're going to homeschool this child and give their date, their name and birthday, and that's it, I believe. Other states require something more. So and that's majority of states. So most states would want you to file, like in Massachusetts, you know, you can file a letter of intent, you know, that says that you're going to homeschool, but that's still not enough. They want to know what your plan is. Now, don't get freaked out about this, because it's changed. It's gotten so much easier for homeschoolers since I was homeschooling in the early 80s. Back then, John Holt and I would advise everybody, drown them in paperwork. Show, like, you know, give them, because they're not going to read your education plan. They just want to know that you're going to do a good job with your kids. So how do you impress an educator or an academic? Throw a lot of paper at them. You know, make them read. You know, make it look good. Have footnotes. Cite research. And so you'll see that that's what a lot of the early stuff in GWS was about. Was not a lot of it, but when they talked about developing education plans, like how do we talk to school officials about this? You know, but over time. And I would spend a lot of time in the late 80s and early 90s, my Learning Without a Curriculum workshop, talking about how you turn your child's activities into school language, you know, to do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there's really no need to get that aggressive with your paperwork. Right now, there are more homeschoolers, and it's pretty easy. Like, most school districts have had to deal with them, so they're not, you know, we're not as unusual as it may have seemed back then. But do take care to just give the minimum of what your state or local district requires if they require you to do this. One of the worst things that I've seen happen is like a Cambridge parent gave like this incredible report, like their child probably was a genius or very gifted. But anyway, the result was when other homeschooling parents came in, they would say, well, the so-and-so parents, they did X, Y, and Z with their kid, and all of a sudden, like now there's this pressure to perform as well as the other unschoolers or homeschoolers in that case. So just give the minimal. We're not here to impress anybody. So what if you impress your local school district? They're not gonna give you an award or college degree or even an elementary school diploma, But there's that need because I guess we all went to school. We all want, and we all want to know that we're doing it right. But just give the minimum because you keep it easy for yourself and you're keeping it easier for everybody else. There are examples in the book Teach Your Own and in many other books that that I'm going to show on a slide as well as on the handout. But when you talk about what you're going to do for the year, use vague, non-committal language. Don't spell everything out. For instance, I like this phrase: topics that we may study include but shall not be limited to the following. And then you talk about what you're going to do. Now, how do you know what's expected for a child? Well, first of all, your homeschool can have a different scope and sequence than a school. Just like Waldorf schools are not hung up on children who don't start reading by first, second grade. Late reading is fine with them. Late reading is fine with in a homeschooling situation too. So you don't need to say that my son will be reading. We will be doing reading activities. He has an interest in the Harry Potter books. She enjoys doing science experiments, and so we're going to buy this. We're going to use this chemistry program and take a course or visit a lab, stuff like that. Just broad lists, and then usually at the end of the year, there's going to be some sort of evaluation. Now, many states like Massachusetts allow you to do a written narrative. We used to write because what happened was you submit your plan at the beginning of the year and it'd be like maybe 2 pages, double spaced, per child about what you think you'll do with them during that year. And then at the end of the year you realize how much you did. That wasn't even on that original document then. And then you create what we call the after the fact curriculum in your report to the school. But even then it's just like we used to say, oh, look at all these wonderful things our kids did. But then we got no feedback from the school year after year. And then as we homeschooled a second child and a third child, each one of these reports, I think the last few we did were less than 2 paragraphs long per child. And no one said anything. So whether they were terribly long or terribly short, I think that all it serves is to make sure that you've dotted the I and crossed the T, and they put it in a file in the State Department or local school district, so that so that they feel that their obligations are covered, and then they deal with what's going on in school, and we are no longer on their radar. So don't get too hung up on having like the best plan. There are books that help you out. Here are a couple of them, and then of course, if you don't want to do that, this is America. There are people who you could pay to do it for you. Third-party evaluations. And the handout, I give a few. And by the way, all these things that are on the handout are, they're not ads, they're not people that have paid me to be placed there. These are things that I know have worked for people over the years. And if you find out that, that's no longer the case or there's something, off about that, I'd like to know because, these are like my personal recommendations. I would like to know. And also things to add. I'm sure that there are so many to add, but I got to spread it out over the course of 4 more webinars. so if you see some books there that you think belong there, wait until the next one when I talk about what you actually do at home on a daily basis. All right. So I also recommend that you go to Alternatives to Home or Advocates for Home Education in Massachusetts, ahem.info, ahem.info/tips for writing your ed plan.html. That is a wonderful, short, sweet page that really describes, I mean, it's specific for Massachusetts, but I think its general guidelines are really good for you in any state that has to write an education plan. And then, of course, another thing to do is, you've got to, you can keep track. I mean, look, you can do like they do in school. As I said, you can go and buy a curriculum and run through the steps. And on the handout, I list many, books, resources, companies that evaluate and sell curriculum. There's no end to that, and programs. But you don't need them in order to evaluate your child or keep track of your child. For instance, you could keep track of your child's progress just like they do in school. You could keep a little journal with their grades, their test scores, and so on. Or you could do what a lot of people do. And again, this is why I say, like, you're already homeschooling. I mean, we call it a portfolio when they homeschool in a transcript. You know what? If your kids are preschool age, you're doing this right now on your refrigerator. Your refrigerator is their portfolio and transcript. That's where you're putting, oh, look, here's a beautiful picture that they drew, or here's a funny comment that they made, or look at this great photo that they, and those things are important. They're important. They're little milestones that you've kept. And you're just going to do that, continue to do that as as your kids become legal compulsory school age, and therefore you have to go through these hoops to keep them at home with you and in the community. Because I want to emphasize, it's not just at home. It's not just one-on-one learning at home. We want our children to, we don't want to duplicate school in our home. That monomaniacal focus on like just learning. Instead, we want our children to have access to the community, to people around them, multiple ages, multiple experiences. Those are the ways that happens, and keeping track of it through scrapbooks, awards, anything any sort of documentation. And with cell phones these days, with all the recording capabilities, it's very easy to keep track of stuff to show. Oh yeah, my child did play in this soccer. My child did participate in this play, and so on. So. Just because and then you can write that down in your evaluation. My child, acted in such play, and if they challenge it, you got the scrapbook memories to show it. There's a lot of ways to get around this, and then usually they ask you have a choice of evaluation method at the end of the year. And if you do, I always recommend doing the narrative. The written narrative is the easiest, and I feel really the most qualitative. But again, if you're into the school at home thing and you're really hung up on tests, fine. Keep track of the test scores. They're there. In fact, a lot of these services, will keep them online and keep them up in the cloud and keep track of them for you. And all the mouse clicks, all the work that they do up there. So that can be an option too. Some states, unfortunately, require testing and quarterly reports. And again, for testing, look for friendly testers, third-party evaluations and stuff, people who understand homeschooling and aren't going to try and jam you up by saying, taking a prep school curriculum that your unschooled child would have a clue about and using that to evaluate whether they're up to a 9th grade level or 4th grade level or whatever. Another thing that you should bear in mind is what they are learning in school, because that's what everyone is going to compare you to. So how do you know? What are you going to do? Well, it's really kind of easy. First, your local school should provide the curriculum outline, and it's usually kept in your local public library, so your reference librarian should be able to help you find it. And what this is just the outline of what they teach in each public school grade in your school district. It's not how they teach each one, it's just like the goals and stuff, but that will tell you what's expected. And if you're embarrassed or you don't want to do that, or you could go online, World Book Encyclopedia. I have this in the handouts. Worldbook.com. It's called Typical Course of Study K through 12, and you can see like what a fifth grader is going to learn in a typical school in America right there online, every subject outlined, and you can see, like, first of all, I think it's really good to do even before you start homeschooling, because you realize how much your children already know. I mean, you know, they expect, you know, children to know how to click a mouse by second grade. If you own a computer and your children are 3 years old or younger, I bet you they know how to click a mouse. You know, so knowledge reduces fear. So I encourage you to gain the knowledge of what passes for curriculum. And so much of it is stuff that children would do anyway. You know, it's just that because school has structured it, we expect it to happen at a certain time. You know, like reading. Like if the child doesn't read by third grade in a conventional school, it's a problem. But, you know, if they were in a Waldorf school or a homeschool or any other situation, late reading is not a problem. And in fact, when the child does learn to read, they learn to read for pleasure and read as well as their age mates. When, you know, at that time, they really just quickly gain their reading skills. So, and I'm going to talk about that. That's actually mentioned on the handouts, I believe, but I'm going to talk about that more in the next webinar too. So, as you're evaluating it, let's say you're in you're not in a loosey-goosey school district. You're in a rather uptight one, you know, very prep school oriented, and, you know, high standards, high expectations. You know, well, you could throw some of these phrases around, and these are the phrases that I find, you know, fit unschooling, homeschooling the easiest. You know, if your child likes pilgrims, you know, American Indians, right? And I use pilgrims. I mean, it's pretty common in the curriculum, but it's also very common here in Massachusetts, of course. So, you know, you're studying the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, and then you take your child down to Plymouth Plantation, and they see how they did things down at Plymouth Plantation, and they may you may read a storybook with them about being on the Mayflower, and then let's say a couple of weeks later you go up to Salem, Massachusetts, and you go to the Witch Museum and you learn a little bit about the witch trials and that stuff. Well, you can, you know, in hindsight, you say, we did a unit on American history studies about, you know, the Pilgrims. And then you outline that. Now, that's after the fact. And you can plan that out in advance, too, of course. But, of course, then you get those situations where the children resist going or something comes up. But I want you to know that you can put that into a unit study after the fact. You know, you can go to a homeschool curriculum fair or the Learning Tree store or, you know, any of these curriculum suppliers and buy unit studies. And, you know, they'll have feathers in there so that, you know, this is what an American Indian, you know, headdress might look like. They might have, you know, books and resources and documents that have been aged to look like original Pilgrim documents and stuff. And they might be able, based on your locality, to recommend different museums and places for you to go. Okay, that's a unit study too. But again, which comes first, right? With unschooling, you know, in particular, and in homeschooling, because, you know, I'm glad I'm remembering this. If you were to do the standard school curriculum, but because you're not dealing with so many kids, I mean, every study for the last like 40 years that I've seen shows that most teachers only spend about 15 minutes of personal time with a student a day. That's it. A child will get 15 minutes of personal attention from a teacher. Now, in a homeschool, they're getting a lot more. In fact, some would say too much, right? But the issue is they finish everything quicker, because they're not waiting for everyone else to finish. They're not waiting. You know, their answers their questions get answered quicker, and so on. So even if you're like trying to do a real rigorous homeschool, school-at-home program, I bet you would be done in about 2 or 3 hours every day. And then what are you going to do with your child? You know, and that's where you start to realize that, you know, unschooling may have a point, you know, or at least this unit study idea where you go out and say, get away from the books, go and do something. Better yet, work. I think, you know, any sort of work or volunteering internship opportunities for any young child that wants to do it. That wants to do it is the key. Is really valuable and so much better than just reading a book and taking a test. Another thing is block learning. This is really, again, it's become much more acceptable because kids, who like to learn computers, you can't tear them away, right? They're learning about, well, that's block learning. If they were like programming or learning how to use Excel or InDesign or build a website and they just spend hours on it, block learning. Again, you can plan this in advance and say that's what we're going to do. Or in hindsight, you could say, your year starts off and your kid has no interest in computers. But guess what? This is, I'll use an example of one of my children. They love horses. My daughter Allison loved horses. And so there was a period there where everything revolved around horses, And we'd spend, so we gave her the permission. You can spend weeks studying horses. Do it. That's fine. That's block learning. In fact, there's a university, I think it's called Knox University, that does that at the college level. A whole semester is just devoted to philosophy. You study nothing else but philosophy. The next semester is science. So again, this idea that you got to break learning up every 45 minutes with a bell and then move them on to something else, that's a factory model. That's not a learning model. We learn like this. Project learning is another way. And that's usually, block learning is very often an individual thing. Project learning is more of a group thing. And that's great. We're going to build a tree house. We're going to go out and, if you want to do something more scientific, you could say, like, we're going to join the Math Olympiad and do a project that way. Well, that wasn't the one. There's one for science that's like the Math Olympiad. Anyway, you get the idea. So if your children are involved in those things, rather than say, oh, my children are socialized and they've done science projects with other kids, you could say, my children do project learning in large group situations with, and then you can name the person that runs the project or the school that they're affiliated, the project's affiliated with or something like that, to give it that patina of respectability if you feel that, they just don't want to hear that you did it. Although more and more they understand, they being the schools, that parents are capable of doing a good job. Here's one of my favorites. USSR stands for Uninterrupted Silent Sustained Reading. Now, I've had parents complain that their children want to do nothing but read. Like, they'll get on a JAG, Harry Potter, the Divergent series, Twilight. That's all they want to read, and part of me wants to say, aren't you lucky? Because I have so many other parents, and my kids don't want to read anything. I can't get them to read, But in school, that's a school term, USSR, and they are very happy when they can get children to do that because children are just only used to reading when they are told to read. And then they stop reading the minute they've reached the end of what they were told to read. So if they get someone who wants to do uninterrupted, silent, sustained reading, that is considered awesome. Well, this happens a lot more in homeschools than you would imagine. Take advantage of it and use it to your advantage. If your kid isn't doing a lot of math, but they're reading a ton of books, tell them they're doing a lot of USSR at home, and oh yeah, and just in case you're wondering, what happens if they say, yeah, well, all they're doing is language arts and reading, and there's no math there? Well, guess what? Your school, your curriculum, you can be a language arts-based school, and we will remediate. We're going to deal with math. We're going to learn math through these other projects that we're going to be doing. Because, math is part of life. It's only in school where we separate math from English, from science. But they're all related. And trust me, if your child isn't learning math but they're reading books like crazy right now, they will learn the math they need to learn as a result of having the positive experience of reading a lot and gathering that information and feeling confident that they're capable of doing this. In fact, they may even choose to read books about math. A lot of great stories. Galileo's Daughter by Dana Sabella is a great story about math and science, but told as his biography. In schools...
Hey, Pat, I just wanted to hop on and let you know that you've got about 7 minutes till 4 o'clock.
Oh, goodness, I am just raging here. I'm sorry.
You're doing a great job. You're very engaging.
Sorry. All right, well, thanks for that. So a learner-initiated activity. In school, if they get that, they write that down. Well, think about how often this is going to happen in your homeschool. Dynamic assessments. Again, what's that? That's if a kid makes change correctly. That's like in a real-life situation, they did something that you weren't sure they could do. Like, perhaps introduce themselves because they were shy, or ride a bike without being supported, or read a book on their own without being prompted for the cues, solving math problems, doing stuff. These are dynamic assessments. These are the sorts of evaluations that we know. And then, of course, differentiated learning, which is a real big buzzword in schools, but homeschoolers have been doing it forever. You got 3 kids at home, 3 different ages. You're not going to give them all the same thing. In fact, they're not going to choose to do all the same thing. Although, when they might. The younger one wanting to do what the older one is a very common situation that parents have to figure out in a homeschool situation. But differentiating the learning, doing different things, using different methods for different style, for different children at different times, these are all great things to use. The problem with evaluation is that we get hung up that if they pass the test, it shows they know something. I argue that what that shows is that they have an apparent knowledge. I studied algebra, I studied calculus, I studied Latin, and I studied Spanish. I can't speak those languages, and I could barely, I could do algebra if I have a book in front of me and I refresh my memory. But I don't use any of them. I passed those tests. I was considered a good student. That is apparent knowledge. When I was speaking in Florida a few years ago, someone said, they started laughing when I said apparent, when I showed the slide, because I first said apparent knowledge. I gave this talk, and then I showed the slide, and I said, oh, I thought you said apparent knowledge. And I think that better describes what I'm talking about, just the parroting knowledge. Real knowledge is the knowledge you build on and use on, and that's the knowledge that we want to have with children, not like this performance art of I passed the Spanish test and I can't speak Spanish. And then, up to whose grade level? Well, here's that typical course of study, worldbook.com, you can find that out. Look what E.D. Hirsch wants. He's got his core knowledge curriculum. Montessori schools, Steiner schools, they have a different curriculum. Alternative, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. The Common Core, that's now another one. Reggio Emilia, their curriculum. Summerhill is different. Distance learning schools, they're all different. And, and that just shows that we all have these different learning schedules. I chose this because here's John Holt at 3 different points in his life. This is him in 1931 in his grammar school class. Imagine what his school was like then in their uniforms in New York City. Here's John Holt in the middle, in the 1950s, teaching 5th grade. As he said, a hard grader. He was a hard grader and a very conventional teacher. And then here he is as an older man, unschooler in the late 70s. He changed over time. You can too. We all do. We all have different learning schedules. We all do this in different ways. And Howard Gardner has proposed these 8 multiple intelligences to show that not only do we learn by processing the information differently, we also have learning styles which are different than multiple intelligences. That's how we feed those intelligences. Now think of this: you have a child that has various learning styles, 8 intelligences, of which one may be dominant at a particular time, and then a teacher has 20 to 30 children to try and balance all this out and figure out how to personalize it. This is why this isn't being used widely in schools. It's just too hard for them. But you at home can do this. You can see that your child is a bodily learner and work with that so much better. And if they're intrapersonal, meaning that they're quiet, they don't, they like to sit in a tree fort and write in a journal, take walks alone and stuff, and think about stuff. So much easier to have that sort of learner at home than in a school. And in school, an interpersonal learner, someone who learns by talking and communicating, well, they get in a lot of trouble in school. So you can see that, that it's a great idea, but it's a problem. So, to enact in school. So I just want to end now, real quickly, the pitfalls. Whatever you do, Don't think that there's only one way to do it. Don't get hung up on only, oh, I'm a failed unschooler, I'm a failed homeschooler, because there are many ways to do it. As I said, it's a continuum. Pick and choose. Try different approaches. Take advantage of the flexibility and freedom of homeschooling. You need to always be open and honest with your kids. Communicate, don't dictate. Because boredom is often a sign of communication failure. If a child learns their parents don't take their interests and ideas seriously, communication shuts down. Or the child gets so used to top-down management that they depend on the parents to tell them what to do at the expense of developing initiative. This is what teachers complain about all the time in school. For unschoolers, don't forget that children can't be helped to change and grow unless they're advised about what's wrong and what they can do to fix it. Don't use self-directed learning as an excuse not to have difficult discussions with your children. Unasked for teaching is terrible, but only you know your child, and sometimes the nonverbal cues your children send speak volumes to you in ways that others can't. Not communicating doesn't protect or support your children. It keeps them stuck. The tone and style you use is really important. There's much more. You have to keep the joy of learning alive for you too. Dr. Raymore wrote a book called Homeschool Burnout on this. Learning is a process and not a series of experiences to be accumulated and cataloged in a deadly manner. It's the overly serious parents who sometimes inadvertently prevent their children from having the joy of discovery. There is so much satisfaction derived from something that he or she could call his or her own. Don't end up doing so much yourself that you wind up taking yourself too seriously and doing it for your child. Let's see. Don't be patient. Do be patient. Don't push your child to keep up to a particular grade level. Take the time and care to choose materials, utilize community resources, and encourage individual projects. If you're too quick to compromise in selecting materials, the time is lost in dealing with subpar classes and texts, and subpar materials and experiences. Take the time to figure it out, and be sure to include people from the community in your plans. These people can tap your child's capabilities beyond your expectations. It's not just you. Children need other people. And then finally, if we or our children are too uptight or on edge, it's important to look at how testy we are. If we and our children are stale and tired, it's time to face up to whether the flame is still alive enough in us. If our children are overwhelmed and exhausted, it is time to look at the value we are placing not only on their personal lives and well-being, but on our own. We must be willing to accommodate ourselves to a more relaxed, yet still creative and challenging regime. So take care of yourself, and you will take care of your relationship with your family too. Never sacrifice your relationship with your children or your family, your spouse, on the altar of education. Education isn't nearly as important as having good relationships and being a good parent and loving your family. Always put that first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat, for coming in today.
My pleasure. Sorry I went over there.
Oh no, you were on a roll. I barely wanted to pop in and say anything.
Okay.
Is there a way for people to contact you if they have questions after the fact?
Absolutely. They could go to the Facebook page, Starting to Homeschool, and they could go to the Starting to Homeschool website, and do it that way, or they can come to the johnholtgws.com website and email me from there.